What would you do if you had everything, yet lost the only people you truly loved? Imagine standing on top of the world, money, power, fame, yet falling to your knees in the middle of the night, crying like a broken child. That was the reality of one of the world's wealthiest men, a billionaire who had conquered boardrooms, but couldn't conquer his own pain. He stood in the rain, his fortune useless, his heart shattered, whispering to the darkness that he had nothing left to live for. And then, it happened. From the shadows, a man with torn shoes and empty pockets appeared. A man the world ignored. A man who had nothing. Yet with one word, just one word, he gave the billionaire something priceless. That word didn't just calm his tears, it rewrote the story of his life forever. This is not a tale about wealth. It is not about the size of your bank account or the power of your name. It's about how a forgotten soul on the street carried a truth so powerful, it changed a billionaire's life in ways money never could. Stay with me, because once you hear that word, you will never forget it. The night was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that made even the busiest streets sound hollow. A drizzle fell gently over the city, making the neon lights blur into long streaks of color on the wet pavement. Cars had slowed, people had disappeared into their apartments, and only those with nowhere to go remained outside. One of them was Michael, a homeless man with worn-out shoes and a coat that was no match. For the cold, he sat beneath a broken street lamp, shivering slightly, watching the world rush past as if he didn't exist. But across the street, another man stood in a place no one expected a billionaire. His name was Richard Hale, a man whose name was printed across newspapers, who owned towering buildings that touched the clouds, who had everything money could buy. Yet tonight, Richard was crumbling. He leaned against the side of his limousine, his body bent as if carrying a weight invisible to the world. His chauffeur stood awkwardly a few steps away, pretending not to notice, but Richard didn't care. His face was buried in his hands, his shoulders trembling. He was crying to the world. Richard was untouchable, a symbol of wealth, power, and success. But the man under the street lamp saw something the others didn't, the fragility behind, the suit, the pain that money couldn't silence. Michael's eyes narrowed. He had seen wealthy men before, but never like this. Curiosity pulled him to his feet. He crossed the street, his footsteps splashing in shallow puddles, until he stood a few feet away. The chauffeur tensed, moving forward to block him, but Richard lifted his hand weakly and whispered, "Let him be." Michael's voice was raspy, weathered by years of begging for coins and sleeping under bridges. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked softly, though he already knew the answer. Richard lifted his head, and Michael saw eyes red with grief, lines etched deep into a face that should have only reflected triumph. His lips trembled as he tried to speak, but the words came out broken. "I've lost everything that mattered." Michael tilted his head. "But you're a billionaire. How can someone like you lose everything?" Richard laughed bitterly, a sound more painful than his silence. "Money builds empires, but it cannot bring back the dead. My wife, my son, gone in a car crash. And all I did was work, chase more, earn more, thinking there would be time later. Now there is no later." His voice cracked, his chest heaving as tears poured down. "I would give all my fortune, every building, every dollar, just to hear them laugh once more, but I can't." The city carried on around them, blind to the billionaire's collapse. But Michael, a man who had slept in alleyways for years, understood loss differently. He bent down, lowering himself to Richard's level. And for a moment, their eyes locked. One man with nothing. One man with everything yet still empty. Then, Michael whispered a single word. It was not rehearsed, not clever, not the kind of thing found in books. It was raw, born from his own scars. He said, "Still." Richard blinked, confused. "Still." Michael nodded slowly. "You still breathe. You still wake up. You still have a choice. You still carry their love inside you, even if they're gone. Still, you can live for them." The word hung in the air like a seed waiting to grow. Richard stared at him, stunned into silence. For years, people had spoken to him with respect, fear, or greed, but no one had spoken to him with such plain truth. Michael continued, his voice steadier now. "You think you've lost everything, but you haven't. You lost people you love, and that pain will never fade. But you still have the chance to honor them, to carry their memory, not by crying here in the rain, but by living in a way that would make them proud. Still you can change. Still you can rise." Richard's hands shook. but I don't know how. Michael let out a breath, his eyes distant, as though remembering his own story. I once had a family too, a wife who baked bread every Sunday, a daughter with hair like gold. I worked day and night, chasing money, just like you. Then came the layoffs, the debts, the drinking to numb it. I lost them both. Walked home one night and found the house empty, their laughter gone. I thought life was over, but I'm still here. And every day, I fight to believe that means something. The billionaire's heart pounded as the homeless man's words pierced, deeper than any sermon, deeper than any therapy session he had attended. His grief wasn't lessened, but suddenly it felt less like a grave and more like a burden he could carry. The chauffeur shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene, but Richard raised a hand again. "Keep going," he whispered. Michael leaned closer, his face shadowed by the flickering street lamp. "Life doesn't end when people leave us. It ends when we stop living for them. You've cried, and you'll cry again. But don't waste the breath you still have. Still you're alive. That's more than some of us get." For a moment, neither spoke. The city hummed in the background, cars splashing through puddles, the drizzle soaking their clothes. Then Richard wiped his face with his sleeve, staring at the homeless man who had nothing yet gave him something. No fortune ever had clarity. Michael sat back, his body tired, his eyes weary. He wasn't preaching. He was simply sharing the truth he had carried through endless nights of loneliness. Richard's tears slowed, his breath steadied, and in his silence, the billionaire knew something had shifted. That one word still was no longer just a word. It was a command, a challenge, a lifeline. But as Richard straightened, wiping the last of his tears, a question burned in him. Who was this man? This stranger who looked like a beggar yet spoke like a prophet? He wanted to know more. But Michael only leaned back against the street lamp and whispered, "Your driver is waiting. Go, but don't forget still." Richard stepped into his limousine, his mind spinning, his chest heavy yet strangely lighter. As the car pulled away, his eyes stayed fixed on the man in the shadows. The billionaire had come undone in front of a stranger, and that stranger had given him a word that might change everything. And in that quiet night, both men, the one with nothing and the one with everything, carried the same truth in their hearts still. The limousine's taillights vanished into the misty night, but Richard Hale's mind refused to leave that flickering street lamp behind. Inside the car, silence pressed against him, heavier than before. The chauffeur glanced at him through the mirror, waiting for an order, but Richard only whispered, "Home." His voice was quieter, yet steadier than it had been moments ago. When he arrived at his mansion, the house felt colder than ever. The marble floors echoed with emptiness, every room reminding him of laughter that would never return. He sank into a chair, replaying Michael's word again and again. Still, still, still. It was as if the homeless man had etched it onto his soul. That night, Richard didn't sleep. Instead, he wandered through hallways lined with portraits of his wife and son, whispering to their painted faces, "I'm still here. I can still live. I can still honor you." Morning broke, and with it came something Richard hadn't felt in weeks: resolve. For days, he returned to the same street, searching for the man who had stopped his collapse with a single word. Michael wasn't there the first day, nor the second, but on the third evening, in the drizzle once more, Richard found him sitting against the lamppost, eyes half closed, a paper cup beside him. Richard approached slowly. "Michael," he said, his voice almost reverent. The homeless man looked up, surprised. "You remembered my name." Richard smiled faintly. "How could I forget? You saved me." Michael shook his head. "I didn't save you. I only reminded you. The rest is up to you." But Richard wasn't satisfied. He sat down beside him, ignoring the damp ground, soaking into his tailored suit. "Teach me," he whispered. "You spoke one word that pierced deeper than anything I've ever heard. Teach me what I failed to learn." Michael studied him carefully, his gaze searching for sincerity. Then, with a sigh, he said, "Very well. But understand, what I have to teach isn't the wisdom of books or boardrooms. It's the wisdom of loss." And so began nights that Richard would never forget. Night after night, he left behind the glass towers and luxury halls to sit beside a man the world ignored. Michael told him stories of people he had met on the streets. Mothers who gave up meals so their children could eat. Fathers who carried guilt heavier than hunger. Strangers who shared a blanket on freezing nights. "Out here," Michael said, "we measure wealth not by what you hold, but by what you give when you have nothing. Richard listened, truly listened, for the first time in his life. He realized how often he had dismissed men like Michael as failures, never stopping to hear the truths they carried. Each story was a mirror, forcing him to confront the emptiness in his own world. One night, Richard asked, "Do you ever regret it, losing everything?" Michael's eyes glistened under the dim light. "Every day, but regret is a shadow. It follows you, but it doesn't have to guide you. What guides me now is the thought that maybe, just maybe, my pain can prevent someone else from making the same mistake." Those words struck Richard harder than any loss report, harder than any business failure. For the first time, he saw his wealth not as a monument to himself, but as a tool that could mean life or death for others. Weeks passed. The billionaire and the beggar became unlikely companions. Richard brought food some nights, blankets others, but Michael always reminded him, "Don't pity me, listen to me, learn from me." And Richard did. He learned that value wasn't in skyscrapers, but in kindness, that success wasn't in profit margins, but in purpose. Michael's one word still had grown into a philosophy that began to change Richard's life. Soon, whispers began. The press caught sight of the billionaire sitting on a sidewalk beside a homeless man. Photographs spread, headlines questioned his sanity. "Has Richard Hale lost his mind?" one paper asked. But Richard no longer cared. For the first time since the accident, he was learning to live again. Then came the night everything shifted once more. Richard arrived at the street lamp carrying 2 cups of hot coffee, but Michael wasn't there. Hours passed, the drizzle turned into a downpour, yet the spot remained empty. Panic began to rise in Richard's chest. The man who had given him hope, who had taught him what no fortune ever could, was gone. The next morning, Richard searched shelters, hospitals, alleyways. Days turned into a week, until finally he found Michael in a charity clinic, frail and coughing, his strength nearly gone. Richard rushed to his side, gripping his hand. "Why didn't you tell me you were sick?" Michael's lips curved into a weak smile. "Because my sickness doesn't matter. What matters is that you've begun to live again." Tears filled Richard's eyes as he whispered, "Don't you dare leave me now. I need you." Michael shook his head gently. "No, Richard, you don't need me. You already have what you need. One word, still. Carry it, live it, pass it on." Richard wept openly, his heart shattering because he knew what those words meant. The man who had nothing had given him everything, and now he was slipping away. That night, as Richard left the clinic, he made a decision. He would not let Michael's lesson fade into memory. He gathered his wealth, not to expand his empire, but to build something new. Shelters rose in forgotten neighborhoods, food kitchens spread across the city, clinics opened where none had existed before, and at the entrance of each, carved in stone, was one word. Still, people asked why that word, what it meant. Richard would smile, his voice soft but certain. "Because as long as you're still here, you can rise again." Months later, Michael's bed at the clinic lay empty. The city moved on, but Richard never did. Each night he returned to the street lamp where they first met. Sometimes he sat in silence, sometimes he spoke aloud as if Michael was still there. And every time, he whispered the same promise, "I'm still living, because of you." The billionaire had been broken, drowning in grief, yet a homeless man had taught him what he had failed to learn all his life, that as long as breath remains, there is hope, there is change, there is love. And so, the story spread. Not of wealth, not of power, but of a billionaire who was crying, and a homeless man who said one word that changed everything, forever. The city had changed. Streets once filled with forgotten faces now echoed with voices of hope. Shelters bore the mark of generosity. Food kitchens never closed their doors, and children who once went hungry now carried warm meals in their hands. Richard Hale's fortune no longer built towers of glass, but pillars of mercy. And everywhere he went, people whispered about the strange word engraved above every door. Still, for most, it was just a word. But to Richard, it was everything. Was the word that pulled him back from the edge of despair. The word that taught him life did not end with grief. The word given to him by a man the world ignored. Months passed, and Richard returned often to the small clinic where Michael had once stayed. But one morning when he asked for him, the nurse lowered her eyes. Michael was gone. No funeral, no gravestone, just another nameless man lost to the city's shadows. The news hollowed Richard, yet strangely, he did not break. Instead, he felt the weight of a new responsibility. Michael's story could not end nameless, not when his one word had saved a life worth billions. That very evening, Richard ordered a monument to be built at the street lamp where they had first met. A tall stone, simple and unadorned, with only 2 lines carved deep into it. He had nothing, yet he gave everything. Still, the monument drew people from across the city. Homeless men and women gathered there, not to beg, but to remember. Families stood quietly. Children touched the stone, and some whispered their own silent prayers. It became a place not of loss, but of strength, a place where broken souls remembered they still had a chance. And every night, Richard came to He no longer arrived in a limousine, but on foot, in the same rain-soaked streets where it had all begun. Sometimes he sat alone, sometimes with strangers, sometimes with those who needed to hear the same word he had once heard. And always, before leaving, he touched the stone and whispered, "I'm still here. Thank you." One evening, as he sat watching the city lights blur against the drizzle, a boy, no older than 12, approached shyly. His clothes were ragged, his hands trembling as he held an empty cup. Richard looked into his eyes and saw the same hunger, the same fear, the same loneliness he had once seen in Michael. The boy whispered, "Mister, do you think I'll ever matter?" Richard's heart twisted. He placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder and spoke the very word that had saved him. "Still, as long as you're here, you matter. Never forget that." The boy's eyes widened, as though a spark had been lit inside him. Richard watched him walk away, shoulders straighter, steps steadier, and for the first time, Richard understood. Fully, Michael had not just saved him, he had given him a word to pass on, a flame to carry into a world drowning in shadows. The billionaire had once been broken, shattered by grief, blind to the truth. But a homeless man, armed with nothing but one word, had given him more than fortune, more than comfort. He had given him life again. And so the story lived on, not of wealth, not of power, but of a billionaire who was crying, and a homeless man who said one word, a word that changed everything, forever. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Make sure to subscribe to Legacy Ignited so you never miss more powerful stories like this one. And if you've already subscribed, thank you for being part of this journey. Your support means everything. Together, we're building a place where stories can heal, inspire, and ignite hope. Thank you for watching.